All right, thank you for joining us today for our webinar being recorded for the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools as part of the module by Board on Track titled Fixing Your Meetings to Strengthen Your Board. Before we get into today's program, let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Mazzoni. I am Director of Leadership and Governance Training here at Board on Track. All right, so let's jump into this, fixing your meetings and strengthening your board. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start off by covering what makes board meetings ineffective. From our work with hundreds of charter schools across the country, we've seen good meetings, we've seen great meetings, and we've seen downright terrible meetings. So we're going to talk first about, from our experience, what makes some of these meetings so ineffective. Then we're going to talk about what the three big key components are to effective board meetings. We're going to briefly cover the Open Meetings Act. We're going to talk about building your board meeting calendar for the year, also your agendas. We're going to talk about meeting facilitation. We're going to talk about board meeting minutes and how you record the meeting. And then we've got a quick set of tips for you as well. So let's go into it. What does make board meetings effective? You can tell if the meeting is effective or not. You've been to some. Board on Track, we feel really strongly that no board meeting needs to last longer than 2 hours. Gasps go up across the room when we hear that many people's board meetings last 3, 4, 5 hours long. Why is this? It's because they're ineffective. So again, we're really focusing on best practice tips for effective meetings, which includes efficient meetings that are consistent and that really have a strategic focus so that they're really impactful and not just time-consuming. So what makes them ineffective? From the board's perspective, we often find that there's this inherent problem that boards are unclear about what they are supposed to be doing. They're not really sure what their role is, and or they don't have clear expectations and roles and responsibilities and priorities for what it is that they're supposed to be working on. They don't have what we would call their own work. So what we often see here is that the meeting time ends up being taken up by getting updates from the administrative team, the CEO and her team, and that's a major problem because it gives boards the feeling that they're just spinning their wheels. So the consequence of that is that there are no consequences if they don't do their work. We had a board member at a retreat we facilitated recently who asked this really poignant question about the role of the board, and he said, let's think back together as a team. If this board hadn't existed for the last 2 years, would anything look different in our organization? And it really made the board think. So if you aren't doing your work, there are no consequences if there isn't really a value add in a direction that the board is heading. Another major thing we see here is that gets to the root of this problem is when board members give themselves a pass for being quote unquote only volunteers. In another presentation, you saw me talk about that. That's a problem that we see with a lot of boards is that they know that this is a volunteer part-time position and they give themselves a pass. So they let bad practices slip. They have use that as an excuse for poor performance, and therefore meeting time doesn't really matter. It's inconsequential, and we really want to change. That's really a culture problem that all of these things get at that we want to try and flip on its head. We want the board to have clear direction. We want them to have their own work that they own. We want them to be a value add to the organization, and we want the expectations for board members to be high. The high expectation for students, we want high expectations for the performance out of our adults on the team, which are our board members. On the flip side of that, on one side where we've got boards that don't have priorities, don't have a direction, don't understand what they're doing to add value to the organization. On the flip side, we have boards that are being asked to do too much, whether it's from the leadership team of the board or from the CEO and her team. The board is being delegated too much, so it's unrealistic for them to accomplish what they need to. Oftentimes, you couple that with not having great time management skills, and what you end up having are board meetings that go on too long. The advanced materials don't guide the board to be strategic. As you heard me say just a moment ago, really want these board meetings to be strategic events. And what I mean by strategic is not just that we've planned out the board meeting, but we want our time, our valuable time as board members to really be focused on the long-term planning of the organization. You heard me say that board meetings really shouldn't last longer than 2 hours. So if you take that 2 hours per meeting, one meeting per month, that means that you and your full team only have 2 hours per month to get this great work done. There's some tips that we include in other presentations about how to manage this work, which includes having really strong and effective committees. But it's important here to make sure that the materials that you distribute in advance do a good job of setting up the discussion so that board members are prepared when they get into the meeting to ask questions, and you're not spending all of the board meeting time educating board members on background information that was included or should have been included in the packet. Does that make sense? Really important to make sure that that board meeting time, oftentimes we see a board packet go out that just has the agenda and maybe some cover sheets about some topics that they're going to talk about. Really what we want to see is those packets go out in advance with the agenda and as much detail and background and support documents as possible for each one of those agenda items. So that you and your board members, you can think of it a little bit like a flipped classroom where your board members are doing some homework behind the scenes where they're prepping for these meetings, trying to understand the topics and preparing some really good questions to ask. That way that stuff doesn't need to happen at the full board meetings. From the CEO or the school leader's perspective, we see this all the time. Think about the meetings you've been to. We see it all the time that the CEO does all the work and all the talking. So the board chair might introduce the meeting and take attendance and pass the minutes, but then after that, we see the CEO run the rest of the meeting. So that means that they are giving all the presentations and they're answering all the questions and all the reports come through them, and they're doing all the talking. And so what does that mean? It oftentimes means that it's symptomatic of some of these things, that the board doesn't know how they add value and what their work is, but also getting down to the second bullet. Oftentimes this might be from an inexperienced CEO or principal, somebody who does not have direct experience with managing and supporting a board. So what we see here is that they don't know how to harness the energy and talent of that board. So we've got a strategically developed board that's been organized so that board members can contribute specific skills and experiences. And in addition to the chair and the leadership of the board, we really do rely on this being a partnership with the CEO, where the CEO is going to foster and support the work of the board. If you haven't done so already, the second module here is on the CEO board partnership, and we get to a lot of the heart of this matter in that presentation about how the board and the CEO support each other in their work. Excuse me. So now let's talk about what are the three big components of effective board meetings. They are meeting facilitation, having a strategic focus, and meeting evaluation afterwards. So when we talk about meeting facilitation, we're talking about having a really strong board chair who understands not just how to manage the conversation, but is also paying attention to the time and accurately follows the agenda, not just from the topics, but also the time that's been allocated to each agenda item. When we talk about the strategic focus, you've heard me mention it a couple times. Here at Board on Track, we are really trying to push our boards to become more strategic and less reactive. If you've got an existing board, take a look at your meeting minutes and agendas from the previous couple years. Really good way of getting an indication as to how strategic your board is to take a look at your previous minutes and agendas and just do a quick rough math on the back of a napkin. Just tally up what percentage of that agenda or what percentage of that time was dealt with things in the future. So planning, looking over the horizon, talking about things that are coming up, positioning the board for the future versus dealing with the here and now. So getting reports on things that have already happened, getting updates on things that have already happened, or answering questions that need to be answered in an emergent situation. So sort of putting out the fire of the day. And then lastly, this is a huge missed opportunity for most boards because they see it as this sort of long-term thing, which is a meeting evaluation, that they've got too much to deal with the here and now. They don't have time to discuss the meeting evaluation. However, from our experience, we can tell you that boards who do take the time to evaluate their meetings regularly tend to have much more efficient board practices altogether and spend a total of less time in meetings and taking up that precious time for your valuable volunteers. Why is that? Because our meetings are ripe for improvement. Let's just say that. There tends to be a lot of room for improvement. When you're in the heat of the moment doing the meeting, it's hard to, even for the best facilitators, to reflect on what's going well and what could be improved upon. So as a matter of practice, it's great to have the governance committee, but especially even the board chair or staff person facilitate a process of just checking in with board members, even if it's done informally, after each board meeting. So a monthly evaluation of your board meetings, what's working, what's not working. Oftentimes you'll find that you might have some quieter or shyer board members who can't get their voice in. Oftentimes, if they have an opportunity to weigh in on meeting evaluation, they might say things like, hey, it'd be great if we could go around the room once during the meeting and call on each person. It'd be great if you could stick more to the time. There are lots of things here that can be improved upon your meetings just simply by asking your board members informally what they think, how they think the meetings are going. So there's one thing that we like to touch upon briefly here because of how important it is to our charter boards. Don't like to dwell on it too much because really don't want this work to have a negative impact or be an obstacle to the board's great work. That is the Open Meetings Act. Every charter school board around the country is subject to their respective Open Meetings Act, Open Meetings Law. Sometimes they're called Sunshine Laws. This slide here is not going to be specific to Wisconsin because we like to highlight that there are some key components of just about every Open Meeting Act around the country, and we want to highlight those for you. I'd like to preface, before we even go into this, I like to highlight that I am an attorney by trade, and sometimes people get nervous when we talk about the open meeting law because it's so complex and they feel like they either need to be a lawyer or be an expert on the subject in order to be able to navigate the open meeting law. What I want to go ahead and tell you is do not be afraid of the open meeting law. It is designed here to support the work that's going on behalf of the public, and it is not intended to be an obstacle to boards' work. I also want to say you do not need to be an expert on the Open Meetings Act. You have a team of folks that are there to support you, including your CEO and her team. But in addition to that, there should be somebody who is working with your board as legal counsel. So what I like to do with the Open Meetings Act is to identify for board members where some common pitfalls live and to help you understand what a red flag looks like when you see one. That way you can say, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable with this, or this doesn't smell right, or I think there's an opportunity here. And so we're going to open it up to our legal counsel or our CEO and his or her team just to get some weigh in on the legal principles of the Open Meeting Act to make sure that we're covering our bases. So like I said, really the important thing for you all is the takeaway here is to remember the intent of the law. That's the most important thing. The intent of the law is to allow the public to see the process of deliberations and decision-making of the public body. As we've said before and in other presentations, you as the Board of Trustees or the Board of Directors, you truly are on the Board of Directors. You are governing a multi-million-dollar public enterprise. So it's really important as fiduciaries, as those who are legally responsible for this entity, to conduct your business in such a way that the community, the tax base as a whole, members of the public have the ability to observe and in some areas participate in the deliberations and decision making of the board. It's important, like I said, to allow the public to hear the tough questions that your board is asking and the hard choices you're making as a board. Why is this? Because, like I said, they want to make sure that the board members are doing their due diligence when they're making decisions on behalf of the board. So you want to hear the tough questions that are being asked of the CEO and his or her team. And also for the benefit of the board, you want them to have an understanding of the very tough questions that public school boards have to make, right? A lot of, especially with public school boards, there's a lot of give and take. In an ideal world, board members would probably have a lot more financial resources at their disposal, and they'd be able to make fewer compromises. The way it stands right now, most public school boards are being pulled in multiple directions, and it's important for the members of the public to be able to understand that you're making these tough decisions and that there's rationale supporting those decisions, that they're not happening in a vacuum. So like I said, most charter school boards tend to be a bit fuzzy on the interpretation of the open meetings law. That's totally normal. They tend to be very complicated, like I said, because they try to cover a wide variety of circumstances. They tend to have very broad rules at the outset, saying that the board work needs to be done in public, but then there are exceptions and carve-outs for things like executive sessions or closed sessions for confidential and sensitive matters. It's also important to remember that not only is the interpretation kind of fuzzy often, but also the membership of your board is constantly changing. So in an ideal world, we like to have constant flow of new blood into your board, so new trustees cycling on and off the board continuously. What does that mean? It means that you've got new people who are most likely unfamiliar with the open meeting law, what its implications are, and how to comply with it. So it's important that we keep the open meeting law fresh and center in our mind, because it can really disrupt board's work if the board is non-compliant. And so you want to make sure that there is a process for periodic training. I like to recommend at a minimum that the full board receives a briefing or training from your legal counsel once a year. It can be done at your summer board retreat or by carving out a half an hour on one of your board meeting agendas. Also like to make sure that your new board members have an opportunity to sit down with the CEO and or legal counsel to get an update on the open meeting law there, and as well any written resources in an orientation packet that you can provide to your new board members is advisable. Excuse me. So next we want to talk about how to build your board meeting calendar for the year. So where have we gotten? Before we're going to have any meetings, it's important that we understand the Open Meeting Acts. Before we have any meetings, we don't want to just throw a couple meetings on the calendar. We want to build out an entire annual board calendar that is strategically developed so that it supports the key deadlines that the board has throughout the year. This is going to be one of the exercises that you're going to be undertaking, is actually developing or making adjustments to your annual calendar based on the work that you know is coming down the pike. So it's important to say that our recommendation is that boards meet monthly. You heard me say it, that board meetings and committee meetings should happen monthly at an absolute minimum. If you are going to do anything different, at an absolute minimum, we recommend that boards meet a minimum of 6 times per year, which works out to just about every other month. This type of thing should be in your bylaws because it's important, because meetings are the real true manifestation of the work of the board. And there's so much of that valuable work that needs to get done. We recommend monthly, and you should go ahead and put it in your bylaws. This will help to support this as a process as the organization lives on in perpetuity. So when we talk about in previous presentations about sustainable board operations, this is part of what we're talking about. So if you've got a founding board, recommend you throw this into your bylaws right at the beginning, that there should be regular monthly board meetings. When you're out recruiting board members, you want to identify board members that understand that this is the expectation and can fulfill this commitment. Again, in previous presentations, we talk about strategically assembling your team so that they're not just well-meaning volunteers, but they're actually been brought in because they have the skills, temperament, and time to govern this multi-million-dollar organization. So encourage you when you're out there recruiting to put together an actual job description that identifies the role and responsibilities of these board members, and include within that a note that that the time commitment includes a board meeting per month, at least one committee meeting per month, and additional events as necessary. So things like a graduation ceremony or a fundraising event, things like that. And then in addition to that, you want to consider how you can remain strategic in your work while ensuring there's accountability to the public trust. All of this is stuff that is built around this notion of having a strategically developed calendar for the year. So when you build your calendar, we want to think about things that go beyond just identifying what the dates and times are. So this is what we often see is sometime over the summer, the CEO and the board chair will sit down with the calendar and they'll plot out the dates and times such that they avoid holidays and busy weeks and things like that. And then they got the calendar put together. What we don't often see, what we don't see enough, we see this really from really strong and well planned out boards, is that you actually develop your calendar after you've got your priorities and your direction for the year ahead. Why is this important? Because the calendar year for a board tends to be very narrow. Most boards get their substantive work done between the months of, say, September and June. They stick off into the calendar year. So that doesn't give you a lot of time to get this work done. Usually it's like 8, 9, 10 months of real substantive work. And so what I see all too often, and especially the board that I used to be legal counsel for, is we would put together our meeting calendar, and then we would have, whether it's because of the holiday season, things might get backed up if something gets bumped from one meeting calendar, from one meeting date to the next, and then all of a sudden you've got a really big calendar, a really big agenda, and you're not able to tackle things that you need to. On the other side of that, you might have a really key vote that needs to take place. Say in March, you're going to have a vote to talk about your contract or your charter renewal. And if you don't have a meeting date that's timed, you can really lose a full month or two if you try to coordinate a committee meeting where the committee is going to finalize their recommendations, and then the next board meeting. So sometimes if you don't have a board meeting that's well positioned based on the workflow of that charter contract, you don't have an opportunity to address it before the board at the optimal time. So what we like to recommend, there are plenty of ways to do this. You can sit down with a pen and paper and just jot it out. Another good thing you can do with the full board is in this exercise where you're going to, the second bullet down here, you're going to place those big rocks into your board meeting calendar for the year to make sure that you can remain strategic. So one exercise to do here is to grab those giant, 2 by 3, 2 foot by 3 foot Post-it boards that you can hang up on the wall. What I like to do is I like to say we're going to have monthly meetings. So I like to write each board meeting month and on a piece of paper and hang up 12 of them around the room. And then what I like to do is to take Post-it notes and to have you and your board members identify what the key votes or decisions that need to be made, write them down on Post-its, and actually post those little Post-its onto the larger Post-its. This way you can visualize how the board meeting calendar for the year is starting to flesh out, and you can literally pick up and move things from one meeting to the next and visualize how your board meeting calendar is coming about for the year. This is really important because it can help you visualize that maybe you've got a lot of backloaded work coming after the holidays that you want to spread throughout the year. Maybe you've got a key vote that needs to take place on March 14th, and your board meeting was scheduled for March 10th. So if you maybe adjust that board meeting or move that agenda item to the month before it, really great way to do that. And then there are some things that you need to do each year that require board time, strategy, and accountability. So things like the budget. You know that the budget needs to be passed each year, so don't let that sneak up on you. Go ahead and plan proactively to discuss it at a given meeting. This will give your committees and your team a target that they're moving forward. It gives you something that they're striving towards. So it'll help keep the finance committee and your finance team accountable to that deadline. And so we know that now we can backtrack that work. And if we know that the budget needs to be passed on March 15th, then we can say at the February board meeting, the finance committee needs to have its final recommendations prepared, which means that the month before that, they might do a drafting session and a iteration session with the CEO. In the month before that, the CEO knows that he or she needs to have the draft budget prepared to present to the committee. So you can think about some of those, both the strategic questions for the year and the routine operational questions for the year. So like I said, think about what these big items are each year. Discuss the time frame for when they occur in or need to be discussed. Write them down, whether it's just on a notebook, a grid, in your computer, so that you can visualize it and plan for the year. So here's a quick template of how you can plan out your meeting. So this is just a very simple little chart here that's got the date, the time, and the activity of the agenda. So you can see here for the next 3 meetings, we've got July, August, and September, 6 to 8 p.m. Like I said, no more than 2 hours per meeting. And then we've got these agenda items. So the July meeting, tends to be planning, focusing a lot on the board's work. So we're talking about here the strategic planning session, identifying our key priorities, our direction for the year. We're going to do our annual meeting, which includes some of this housekeeping things like election of our officers, putting together our calendar of regularly scheduled meetings per year. That's what we're here to talk about today. If you need bank signatories, any of that kind of housekeeping stuff. And then you can see in August, we know that we have our school improvement plans that we're going to review. So we want to make sure we have sufficient time on the agenda to talk about those SIPs. Those of you who've been to one know that they can be time-consuming presentations. So we know that if we've got those school improvement plan, improvement plan review, we also want to make sure we have an opportunity to discuss our annual goals for the year. So it's important that you leave time throughout your year for both of those. All right, so now let's talk about the board meeting agendas. This is how we're really zooming in on making these meetings effective. So the board meeting agendas themselves, critical to making sure that that the meeting focus is going to be strategic rather than reactive. So here we go. We're going to talk about, with the board meeting agendas, we're going to talk about who sets the agenda, when is the agenda set, and what should it look like. So who sets the agenda? It should be a collaborative process. It shouldn't be any one person who's developing it, but ultimately the responsibility rests with the board chair to approve the agenda in consultation with the school leader. So what we see with most with most charter boards, what we see is that typically the CEO and his or her team will have a draft agenda put together based on what they know the big rocks are that are coming down the pike. So they know that they've got to do this presentation today. They know that they've got to do the budget presentation or test scores. Again, when done correctly, none of this should be a surprise. So the board chair and the CEO should be already in sync on what those agenda items are. You're going to rely on the CEO's expertise here if there are ad hoc things, maybe emergency items or things that just were unforeseen when the annual calendar was put together. So they might have some of those items that need to get put on the agenda. They have a collaborative process. Oftentimes this may include an open solicitation to board members if there are any items that they would like to see on the agenda. Totally not something necessary that we see all the time. But it really should be a collaborative process so that the board chair and the CEO are both weighing in, and then ultimately the board chair gives the final thumbs up for the agenda. And then obviously board members have an opportunity, usually at most board meetings, if there was a crisis or something that they felt very strongly needed to be discussed, oftentimes board members have an opportunity to bring those things up. Again, this should not be a surprise. When done correctly, the agenda should almost write itself in advance, and there should be a placeholder there for, like I said, ad hoc items that come about. The agenda should be set at least 1 week in advance. Why is this important? Because if you remember back at the beginning, we want to make sure that we have really robust and comprehensive and strategic board meeting packets so that your board members have an opportunity to do some homework ahead of time, to review the materials, and to come prepared to ask good, tough questions. So it's important that the agenda is set so that those that packet preparation can take place, again, at least a week in advance, because the packet should be sent out at least 1 week in advance to board members. So your board members should have at least one weekend. Doing it a week in advance gives them all weekend to review their packets outside of their work week, to sit down and prep their questions and things like that. So you want the agenda to be set in advance so that they have that opportunity to prepare. Like I said, the expectation should be that all the meeting materials are written, included in that packet so that we can read it. And lastly, you heard me say before, when we reflect on the meetings and evaluate the meetings, you want this to become cyclical, where you're creating a cycle that allows for input and feedback on these items. Here's a sample that you feel free to use for this board meeting cycle prep. So we have right after the meeting, it starts with the board chair and the school leader debrief and identify items that carry over for next agenda. So what's included on this? You might have items where we say, this looks great. We're going to now take our vote on it at next meeting. You could have something that's delayed. Board members might say, I want to do a little bit more background. Can we delay this till the next meeting? It could also include follow-up tasks. So board members at the end of the meeting agree to take on certain tasks before the next meeting. You want to have an opportunity to sit down and debrief, whether it's on the phone or in person, and just take stock of what open questions came from the previous day's meeting. A couple weeks out from the meeting, you want to prepare that draft agenda. So like I said, oftentimes the staff support, so the CEO and or like a board staff person or liaison, will draft an agenda that includes the big items that need to be discussed. That'll get sent to the board chair to weigh in on, and then the board chair and the CEO will send that to board members to review for input. Some boards skip this step if it's a routine that the agendas are pretty non-controversial. 1 week prior to the meeting, any of that board member feedback that was solicited is incorporated within the agenda. It's important that your committees, who all have an opportunity to report out at the meeting, have their reports finalized, again, so that they're very strategic and not reactive. I'm going to pause here just for a moment to identify that this is one of the areas where board meetings get off the rails most easily, is during your committee reports. So I'm going to pause here and say it's really important to give each of your committees an opportunity at each board meeting to report out the great work that they're doing. Why is it? Well, in one sense, you want to honor the work that they're doing. The real engine of your board is going to be the committees. This is where the rubber is going to meet the road. The real in-depth, in the weeds kind of discussions are going to take place. So you want to honor that work. But also it's important, since so much of the work is happening behind the scenes in committees, it's important that each of your board members has an opportunity to hear from the committees that they do not serve on. So it's really important to give an opportunity, even if you're the finance committee. If I'm on the academics committee, there's a finance committee, and I know even if it's not time for us to be presented on the budget, it's important for me as a board member to get a presentation from the finance committee, even if it's as quick as a 2 or 5 minute update saying, just want to let everybody know that we're still working on our draft agenda. We hope to have it finalized for you in a presentation at our next board meeting. Now I know as a board member that there is a team that is marching forward in our budget preparation, and I now know that. Really important here for your committee reports to be finalized and to be thoughtful, because what I often see is during the committee report, the committee chair gets up and starts rambling on and on about all the great work that they're doing, because they want the validation of knowing that they're doing all of this really great work behind the scenes. They want people to hear about it. It's important to have a really great meeting facilitator and someone who can keep this conversation going, because there's a tendency when you hear something that's happening at a committee meeting, there's this desire often for board members to start to weigh in too early, and you can easily eat up a half an hour or even an hour talking about a topic that the committee meeting is still that the committee is still meeting on and trying to refine and finalize. So I know that was a little bit of a tangent, but it's important to think about if you're going to have each of your committees doing a report out, make sure that they're prepping and thinking, is this just a quick update? Is this an actual presentation? If it's an actual presentation, I should have it thought out exactly what we're going to cover. It should be supported by written documents that get sent out to the board ahead of time. And then lastly, the week of the meetings, the board members should be reviewing your board materials, thinking about tough questions to ask, making sure that they fully understand the topic so they're ready to be to engage at the meeting. All right. So what does the board meeting agenda look like? The key agenda items following the mission should include. So once you have the mission statement at the top, this is just a nice thing to reframe everybody, whether you're attending from a member of the public or the board, what it is that we're here to accomplish. Just a nice reminder of what the mission is of the organization. After that, really key to include the attendance. Again, circling back to the Open Meeting Act and how the need to have a quorum of your board in order to conduct board business. You want to make sure you're taking attendance. Oftentimes, this will be coupled with what is known as a consent agenda or a vote to approve multiple routine administrative items all at once. Typically, an opportunity for public comment so that your interested members of the public can come and maybe weigh in or make a statement to the board and say things like a financial report. So this would be a type of order of importance. So you would have the attendance type routine things up at the top, opportunity for public comment, and then the financial reports or whatever the substantive agenda items are below that. Important to flag here often that you've heard us say before that Board on Track does not want to see you out there reinventing the wheel on any of these items. You're inherently creative, entrepreneurial organizations, given that you've taken a school that didn't exist out of the sky and created it. One of the areas where you do not need to use that creative energy and use those creative juices is here with the board governance, especially with things like developing the agenda. We've got template agendas, sample agendas that you can use to make your own. Don't stress about reinventing the wheel here. Just visit our website, www.boardontrack.com, to get those resources. So key agenda items following the mission should include, like I said, those written committee reports, a written school leader report to the extent that there is one. Again, this will help to make sure that the board meeting is spread out so that it's not just the CEO giving presentations, but you'll have your committees weighing in, you'll have a presentation from the school leader, and any previously agreed upon data points in there. So maybe test scores, demographics of students, things like that. Here's an example of what one of those template agendas might look like. As you can see here on the right side, we've got a template agenda, covers some of those items. Feel free to grab this one and make it look like your own. On the left, like I said, we've got the agenda item cover sheet. This is really important. If you notice, it gives some background information for your board members, so when they're prepping for their meeting on the weekend, they can have more context. So you can see here, we tell board members ahead of time what the purpose is of this item. Is it here just for discussion? Is it here for a vote? Is it here for some sort of board action? What's the background? How did we get to where we are? Setting the stage in the context for the vote or the decision that needs to be made. And then lastly, down at the bottom, whatever the formal recommendation is. So whether it's from the committee or whether it's from the CEO and her team, we have a recommendation down at the bottom so the board member understands what is being asked of them. And to the extent that you can, having a pre-written motion. So if you read down here, it says this section should be worded in the form of a motion or motions. Having your support team, whether it's from the committee or legal counsel, actually drafting those memos ahead of time helps to make the meetings seem a little bit more professional and be a little bit more effective and efficient if board members don't have to worry about crafting the legalese of a memo during the meeting itself. All right, so now let's jump into what the board meeting facilitation should look like. So for the meeting facilitation, we're looking at some things like the chair's role. I see here that the title is incorrect. It says calendar of regularly scheduled meetings. This should say meeting facilitation. So we want to make sure that we're crystal clear as to what the chair's role. We want to make sure that the agenda is used and followed. You heard me say that just a moment ago. You want a strong facilitator, board chair who understands the importance of sticking to the timelines and can help facilitate the conversation so that you can arrive at that decision within the allotted time on the calendar. This is going to help us stick to those 2-hour board meetings like we talked about. Want to try and make sure that there are no surprises. So having, again, board meetings that are facilitated effectively can help to avoid surprises. You want to make sure you have crystal clear understanding what the CEO's role is. Are they here to just listen in and report on their items? Do they play a more active role? Are they helping to support the committee reports? Are they, providing color commentary on the academic report on test scores, things like that? You want to make sure your individual board members understand what their role is. So making sure that ahead of time they are prepared for the meetings. You want to make sure that they know that they also need to abide by the time constraints listed in the agenda, etc. Same thing with committees. Just like I said a moment ago, you want to make sure that the committees understand what their reports are going to look like in advance of the meeting. They understand the time that's been allotted to their agenda item, and that they're prepared to accomplish all of that within that time. Same with the role of the public. Is there a public comment period? If so, what are the rules governing that? Is there a time limit? Oftentimes we see a written rule about public comment that says that they must be kept to 3 minutes, or that they must be germane to a certain topic that the board is discussing. And lastly, you want to make sure you cover the role of those other staff members. So we often see senior staff members like your CFO or chief academic officer play a very intimate role alongside the committees and the committee chair with those reports. So just want to make sure that, say, again, coming back to the budget example, when it comes time to discuss the budget, you want to make sure that both the finance committee chair and the CFO are aligned on the role that they're each going to play with respect to that budget. So now we're going to go into one of our last topics, which is everybody's favorite, which is board meeting minutes. So again, just similar to the to the Open Meetings Act, I'd like to highlight here that this is not something that individual board members really need to worry about too much. It's necessary, like I said, to fostering the public trust by making sure that there's documentation of the decisions that the board makes and how they arrive at those decisions. But it's also great for providing an institutional memory so that the board and the organization can reflect upon decisions that were made in previous years and how those decisions were arrived at. As somebody who's worked in the legal counsel for a board like this before, I cannot tell you how unexpectedly pleasant it is when you pull open board meeting minutes from previous years, even 10, 20 years ago, and can find the answer to the question you're looking for as to why a policy was developed or why a decision was made one way versus another. But like I said, individual board members shouldn't stress out about this. This really should, in an ideal world, be the role of a board staff person or liaison. But here on the right, we've got a sample meeting template. Those of you who are members of Board on Track will know that our meeting minutes tool basically walks you through all of this anyway. But meeting minutes are the formal record of the transactions that happened during the meeting. So that is why the full board, you'll notice, votes to approve the minutes at the next board meeting's agenda. Why is that? Because the full board needs to endorse that what the meeting minutes say accurately reflects the decisions and the actions that took place at that previous meeting. So this is the formal record of what happened. I highlight here that minutes are a record of what was done at the meeting, not a transcript of what was said by its board members. This is a really important distinction here. Like I said, the same slide here, minutes are a record of what was done, not a transcript of what was done. So what I like to explain to people who take minutes is that the minutes must reflect the decisions that were made and should provide a sufficient amount of summary of the discussion so that a reasonable member of the public can understand how that decision was made, not necessarily every argument or word that is said by board members. You just want to capture the discussions in such a way that board members, the spirit of the deliberations are captured. All right, so just going to wrap up with three last tips that we've got here. One here is on this key organizational decisions chart. This is a great exercise for you to undertake while you're planning your annual board calendar and you're doing things like that Post-it note exercise where you're planning out the big rocks for your year ahead. Also really important here is to consider putting together an organizational decisions chart that outlines the process for making these really big decisions. Helps to gain clarity on what the key decisions are. It's really great to have the full board weigh in on the degree of urgency. So things like your charter renewal will be much more urgent than maybe a fundraising activity that you're planning for next year. Gives you an opportunity to make sure that the full board, the committees, and your school leader are all on the same page as to what needs to get done, because process is really important when it comes to these big decisions. So a sample of what your key organizational decision chart might look like is below. You can see here we highlight the target area. So we've got academic excellence, finance, what the key decisions need to be made. So if one of the goals for this organization is growth and replication, and they want to expand into a high school, the key decision that needs to be answered is, are we ready to expand into that next school, into a high school? Based on our planning for the annual calendar, we understand that we really need to answer this question by January 1st. Why is it important? Because we need to then go hire a principal and look for locations and start recruiting students. So if we know that by January 1st, we have to have this decision made, it'll help us backdate the planning so that we know when the committee needs to be done, when the CEO's team needs to be done, etc. Highlighting here what the role of the full board is in the decision making, you can see here that it is the ultimate decision. This is a decision that is left up to the board. Ultimately, this is going to require a vote from the full board. What is the committee's role in the decision making? There's going to be a task force that's developed, a position paper where they're going to review where we stand today and consider the recommendations as to whether we are ready to expand to the high school. The CEO's team is going to partner with the task force. They're going to develop this list of key strategic questions. They're really going to be the experts on the ground that we're looking towards to help us answer many of these questions. And as you can see here, we've agreed upon the documentation that the CEO and or the committee are going to use to present to the committee and the full board. So to support the decision making here, we're going to have a final position paper by November 1st that can be iterated on, reviewed by the full board, so that come January 1st, the full board is ready to make that decision. Tip number 2, the drum we're going to continue to beat is strategically using your meeting time. So like I said, you want to plan out all your board and committee meetings throughout the year. And it's not to say that they can't change or that you can't be flexible and nimble on your feet, but planned out for the year. You want to make sure that you're planning enough time, especially with those committee meetings, to be strategic, to have those conversations that get into the weeds with experts, so that the full board meeting time can be really left to answering the strategic questions. You want to make sure that you're planning all this together with the board chair, the school leader, and the full board as a team. Like I said, not just having committees, but having committees that are really focused on what they're doing to contribute to the organization's direction for the year, so that their meetings themselves are strategic, productive meetings rolling into the full board. And again, you want to make sure that your committees are not off there doing their own thing. They really should be partnering with the school leader and his or her team. You know, the finance committee typically works very closely with the CFO, academic excellence team, with the chief academic officer, fundraising with the development director, things like that. All right, and lastly, tip number 3, you're going to want to make sure that you're actually creating and monitoring your annual goals. This is a topic for another presentation, but it's important to flag here because many, if not all, of the tips in this presentation presume that there is a strategic focus and some real clear goals for the year. So it's really important that the full board, typically this is done as part of the annual CEO evaluation, but the full board will weigh in and have an opportunity to endorse the key annual CEO goals for the year. So you want to make sure you create those goals, you approve them as a full board, and you monitor them throughout the year. Those key CEO goals, things like academic, could be academics, attendance, improving test scores, fundraising enough money to build our new school, whatever they are, you want to make sure the full board understands them and tracks them, because these are the things that are going to populate your agenda. So questions about presentations on test scores, presentation on our capital fundraising campaign, things like that. Really important that you have a way of tracking this. This will make your meetings much more efficient if throughout the year board members have access to visualization of the progress we're making, so that we're not constantly relying on just the formal presentations of the CEO and his or her team. So that's a lot that we just covered here today. The takeaways here are to remember that your board meeting time is valuable. You've got busy volunteers that you want to keep them engaged in the work of the board meeting. So you want to make sure that your full board meetings are strategic rather than reactive, so that they're looking to the long term, avoiding and mitigating risk before it arrives at the front door, that your meeting time is facilitated strongly so that they last no longer than 2 hours, and you're really giving an opportunity for the committee work to get done in concert alongside the full board meeting work. So with that, thank you for watching today's webinar. The next couple of exercises will have you undertaking a planning exercise of your own to actually map out and plan your annual board calendar for this upcoming year. Thanks for watching.